Hi history lovers, and welcome back to the channel where I bring you new videos every week on all aspects of the past. Today on History Calling, I'm responding to some queries I got on an earlier video, linked on screen and below, which looked at some of the potential fertility problems faced by Henry VIII and his partners. Beneath that video, I had a number of people ask me if Anne Boleyn was executed whilst pregnant. In this video, I'm therefore going to look at the origins of this theory and whether or not it has any merit. In particular, we'll study the comments made by Henry VIII, which are cited as evidence of pregnancy, and what Anne did and didn't say while she was being held prisoner in the Tower of London and during her scaffold speech directly before her death on the 19th of May, 1536. For other videos on Anne, the rest of the Tudors, and much more, please remember to subscribe to the channel with notifications switched on so that YouTube lets you know every time I upload. If you check out the description box below, you'll also find links to my Instagram account, where my username is History Calling, and to plenty of books, movies and TV shows all about Anne. Anne Boleyn did indeed begin the year 1536 pregnant. However, she lost her child, a boy, at about 15 weeks gestation at the end of January. This was her second such loss, the first having been in mid-1534, and so her only successful pregnancy was that which produced her daughter, Princess Elizabeth, on the 7th of September 1533. She was arrested on the 2nd of May 1536 and taken to the Tower of London, where, after a show trial, she was found guilty of adultery and treason and sentenced to death. She was executed by sword within the confines of the Tower on the 19th and buried in the nearby chapel of St. Peter at Vincula, where her remains still rest. If you'd like to know more about her execution and the Victorians' exhumation of her remains, I have videos on both, which I'll leave linked below for you. Given this timeline, we therefore have a period of less than 4 months in which she could have fallen pregnant again in order to be pregnant on the scaffold. And we need to assume that to know about that pregnancy, she would need to have been at least a month along at the time of her death, meaning she couldn't have conceived later than mid-April. The theory that she was indeed expecting when she died can be traced to the author Alison Weir, who wrote about it in her 2001 book, Henry VIII, King and Court. In this book, Weir writes that in April 1536, Henry had every reason to be pleased with Anne, for the evidence strongly suggests that she was pregnant again. Just as she had conceived rapidly after the birth of Elizabeth, so her reconciliation with the king after the miscarriage in January had quickly borne fruit. Henry made what was probably an oblique reference to her pregnancy that April, when he rounded on Chapuis, that's Eustace Chapuis, the imperial ambassador, for suggesting that God had not thought fit to send him male issue, because he had ordained that England should have a female succession. "Am I not a man like other men? Am I not? Am I not?" shouted Henry. "You do not know all my secrets." On the 25th of April, in a letter sent to his ambassador, Richard Pate, in Rome, and duplicated to Gardiner and Wallop in France, that's Stephen Gardiner and John Wallop, who were both English ambassadors in France at the time, Henry announced the likelihood and appearance that God will send us heirs male, implying that our most dear and entirely beloved wife, the Queen, was once more expecting a child. Had Anne conceived towards the end of February, it would have been possible for the king to state this with some certainty, and clearly he was eager to do so. Weir goes on to add that it is unthinkable, if there had been no certain hope of a child, that he, a normally discreet man in such matters, would have made such a statement, knowing his ambassadors would make it public. On the face of it, this all sounds perfectly plausible. However, Weir has unfortunately made a critical error with one of the sources here and misunderstood the context of the other. The result is that her argument is fatally flawed. Allow me to explain. The conversation with Chapuis, which Weir is referencing, did indeed occur and was reported by the ambassador to this man, Chapuis's master, Charles V of Spain, aka the Holy Roman Emperor, who was the nephew of Henry's first wife, Catherine of Aragon. However, the letter dates from the 15th of April 1533, when Anne was pregnant with Elizabeth. This source is freely available online, and I'll leave a link to it in the description box so that you can check it for yourself, but I promise you, Weir's dating is off by 3 years. The letter even discusses Catherine in the present tense because, of course, she was still alive in April 1533, but was dead by April 1536. That leaves us with the correctly dated comment made in a letter to Richard Pate on the 25th of April 1536 that there is great likelihood and appearance that God will send unto us heirs male to succeed us in the crown of this our realm. Here, though, this source has been misunderstood because this line has been taken out of context. When you read the letter from the beginning, it puts things in a very different light. I'm going to summarise the very start of this letter slightly for the sake of time, but again, I'll leave the original linked below for you if you want to double check my research. Henry writes that the previous Tuesday he had received a visit at Greenwich Palace from Eustace Chapuis, who, on behalf of Charles V of Spain, sought to repair the relationship between the two kings. This relationship had been strained because Charles was unhappy at how his Aunt Catherine and cousin Princess Mary had been treated by Henry, but with Catherine having died on the 7th of January, there were hopes that it could be improved. Chapuis, according to Henry, made unto us certain overtures for the advancement of such a renovation. That's a renovation of the two kings' relationship. The first was that he would be a mean to have a reconciliation between us and the Bishop of Rome, that's the Pope. The second overture and request was that, forasmuch as there is great likelihood and appearance that God will send unto us heirs male to succeed us in the crown of this our realm, we would vouchsafe at his contemplation to legitimate our daughter Mary, in such degree as in default of issue by our most dear and most entirely beloved wife the Queen, she might not be reputed unable to some place in our succession. Can you see the difference here once you read the whole section? As David Starkey has correctly noted, Henry is actually repeating back what Chapuis has said to him on behalf of Emperor Charles. In other words, to try to butter Henry up and have Mary restored to the succession, Chapuis has come to see the king and said, "Your Majesty, I'm sure you will have sons by Queen Anne, but just in case you don't, would you not consider re-legitimising your daughter Mary so that she's able to inherit after any children you have by Anne?" There's absolutely nothing here which either suggests that Anne was pregnant or that Henry thought she soon would be. He's not announcing anything. In fact, after her miscarriage in January, Henry had said that, "I see God will not give me male children," and remarked that he would have no more boys by Anne. I kind of feel like I've made my point and I could end the video right here, but in the interest of thoroughness, I'm going to add in a few other things to consider, just in case anyone is still on the fence about this. First, the idea that Henry, a man who had been struggling for a male heir since 1509 when he came to the throne and married Catherine, would knowingly kill his pregnant wife is preposterous. Even if he wanted rid of Anne, which he did, he could afford to wait an extra 6 or 7 months to see if she had a boy, and then decide what to do with her. Weir attempted to explain this away by saying that Henry wanted the baby dead to avoid, quote, a disputed succession. However, with Catherine of Aragon dead, the succession of any son Anne now bore was much less disputed. Anne herself had said, after her January miscarriage, that it was for the best, because now the next child she conceived wouldn't be conceived during Catherine's lifetime. The king and queen could even have gone through another marriage ceremony if they really wanted to shore up their future children's claim to the throne. Second, the theory that Anne would go to her death knowing she was pregnant and not mention it is also ridiculous. It would have saved her life and her child's. She made no recorded mention of a pregnancy during her time in the Tower, and a bombshell like that would surely have been reported either then or later on by one of her attendants. And if you see my video on her execution, I go through the numerous accounts of her scaffold speech in detail there. These accounts all differ from each other, but something they have in common is that none of them talk about a baby. Weir claims that Anne didn't mention it because, quote, she must have realised that to do so would be futile, for Henry had hardened his heart against her. She adds that the fact that Anne didn't mention Elizabeth whilst in the Tower is additional evidence that she'd given up fighting Henry, both on her own behalf and that of her offspring. In fact, we don't know for certain that she didn't speak of Elizabeth, but even if that was the case, other evidence shows that her daughter's welfare was clearly on her mind during her final weeks. Just days before her arrest, the Queen had already taken what steps she could to protect her child, by asking her chaplain, Matthew Parker, to watch over the princess should anything happen to Anne herself. Finally, Weir speculates that documents relating to Anne's trial were destroyed to cover up any reference to a pregnancy, and says that it's strange the Queen wasn't examined prior to death to check if she was pregnant. I would counter that any document loss or destruction can be attributed to the passage of time, poor record keeping, or a desire to cover up what a shambolic show trial Anne had been put through, and the fact that aspersions may have been cast on Henry's performance in the bedroom. This is something that happened during her brother George's trial, for instance. If she wasn't examined for a pregnancy in the Tower, this can be explained by Henry knowing that she couldn't be pregnant with his child because he hadn't slept with her for such a long time, or by her having had her cycle whilst imprisoned, again proving that there was no pregnancy. Last but not least, and I mention this only because I think I'll get questions about it in the comments if I don't, when Anne was disinterred by the Victorians, there was no evidence of a pregnancy. Given the amount of time that had passed and the fact that any pregnancy would have been in the very early stages, this really doesn't mean anything, especially as she'd evidently been disinterred at some point before the 1870s, but like I said, I thought if I didn't mention it, I would get queries about it. I hope therefore that I've convinced you that Anne Boleyn wasn't pregnant when she died. I'd like to add that to her credit, Weir knows that she made an error here and hasn't pursued this theory. In her 2010 book, The Lady in the Tower, The Fall of Anne Boleyn, she specifically attributes the 1533 letter to the correct year, no longer claiming it comes from 1536. And when citing the Pate letter, she wrote, "Taken at face value, this suggests that Henry was still sleeping with Anne, and it could even imply that he thought she was pregnant again, which is highly unlikely. We should not read too much into him publicly referring to her in such affectionate terms, because he was merely using the conventional style employed by royalty when writing of their spouses." I do wish she'd taken this opportunity to properly explain the Pate letter's context, but this is still a vast improvement on the 2001 book. I'd also like to finish by saying that I'm not telling you to never read Alison Weir, and I don't mean this video to be a personal attack on her. I will admit that I think she can be a little over-enthusiastic in her reading of the sources at times, stretching them beyond what I would consider a reasonable conclusion, such as when she claimed in The Lady in the Tower that Anne had, quote, borne probably a stillborn son near full term in the summer of 1534. In reality, although that pregnancy will have been in its later stages, there is no evidence as to what the baby's gender was or when the pregnancy was lost, and Weir is basing her supposition that it was male on the fact that Chapuis said in 1536, after Anne had definitely lost a boy, that she couldn't bear male children. There's also the claim that she had another miscarriage in June 1535, which is based on an incorrectly dated letter which actually comes from either 1533 or 1534. If you see my video on whether Anne had a pseudo-pregnancy in 1534, it will take you through the evidence for all her pregnancies after Elizabeth and explain all of this in more detail. All that being said, Weir writes in a very accessible manner, and she's helped to bring a lot of people to history, especially that of the Tudors, and I think that that's brilliant. What's more, mistakes happen to all of us, and that very much includes me. I'm still properly haunted by the time I accidentally said Elizabeth I was the daughter of Henry VII instead of Henry VIII, and that's certainly not the only slip I've ever made or ever will make in my videos, so none of us are perfect. I guess my advice would be that if you read or hear someone make a claim which you've never heard elsewhere, maybe just double check the sources. No one is above making a mistake. And that, my friends, brings us to the end of another video. Let me know in the comments below if I've persuaded you that Anne wasn't pregnant at the time of her death, and if you'd like to learn more about her, try one of the videos you see on screen now. Whatever you choose, please enjoy, and until next time, keep learning.